My word is just an official word of welcome, welcoming everybody to this second Women in Gig webinar that is organized by the WageIndicator Foundation. My name is Fiona Drachstra. I'm the General Director of the WageIndicator, and I will be leading you through this webinar today. But we have a lot of exciting speakers today who can share much more with you about the topic that we're discussing. A quick introduction. This is the second webinar that we host in a series of webinars about the gig economy from WageIndicator, and this is the second in the series about women in gig work. And we had a first webinar back in October 2022 about this topic, and that was much more focused about domestic work. But in order to follow this webinar, it's not necessary to have been there, but you can always listen back. And this webinar delves specifically into more women working on online platforms and who are doing freelance and microtasking work. And we will specifically be addressing specific questions around, can platform work actually be a source of decent work for women around the world? And also, does platform work actually replicate or even amplify the gender inequalities that can be found in more traditional labor markets? We will be doing so by having a keynote speech by Janna Besamusca, who's a WageIndicator researcher, but also a researcher at the University of Utrecht, who will be giving her keynote today, setting the scene. Afterwards, we have a very nice panel discussion hosted by Olivia Blanchard, who is part of our WageIndicator Gig team. And we will have a nice best practices session hosted by Martijn Aretz from the WageIndicator Gig team as well, with some nice external speakers who share their experiences with you. Like I said in the beginning, we have a space at the end for a small Q&A, but if you have questions, please feel free to add them in the chat, and we will try to also answer them in between. The session will be recorded, so please let us know if you do not like to be seen or somewhere, so we can crop you out of the video at the end.
You can always, sorry, just chime in. You can also turn your camera off, and then you also will be recorded.
Yeah, so you won't be seen, but we can also take your name off the screen to make sure that you won't be seen. We generally would like people to be muted when other people are talking. If you cannot mute yourself, we will mute you. Sorry about that. But that's just to make sure that people can speak. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Janna. Have a good webinar, everybody.
Thank you, Fiona. Let me just take a short moment to start sharing my screen. All right. Wait. Yes. All right. Thank you for the welcome. Let me see if you are seeing the full screen PowerPoint now. I hope. Yes. All right. So I'm Janna Besamusca. I'm an assistant professor of interdisciplinary social sciences at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And my research is mainly into gender inequality in the labor market, particularly in regard to persons with care responsibilities. And now the speakers on the next panel are going to discuss whether gig or platform work can create a more gender equal labor market by offering opportunities that traditional forms of paid work do not. And so the basic comparison in these discussions really is with traditional employment in firms or enterprises. And so to facilitate that discussion, I will spend the next few minutes briefly outlining what we actually know about the way in which gender inequalities are generated in the labor market and in the workplace. And so starting with gendered labor market inequalities as a phenomenon. Now, we know that there are several ways in which employment of people identifying as women differs from those identifying as men. And we call these differences gender gaps. And most of the knowledge in this field stems from studies using a binary conceptualization of gender. And so in the remainder of the talk, I will refer to men and women only. To start with, women are less likely to be employed in paid work than men. And this is something that we observe globally. although the size of these gender gaps differs substantially. Now, for example, in the dark green countries on this map, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in the Nordic countries, female employment rates are high and gender gaps in employment are pretty small. But in others, for example, in India or the MENA region, only about a third of women are employed and gender gaps are large. Now, when women do work, they often work fewer hours than men on average. And that can be anywhere between a couple of hours a week, say 8 or 12 hours, and almost a full-time working week, say 29 hours. And part-time work is especially common in women in high and middle income countries, such as in Europe and in Latin America. Thirdly, on average, women are also paid less than men. And in part, this is because women are still paid less for the same work. An even larger factor, however, is that women tend to do different work than men. And so women work in other jobs, work in different sectors, and the jobs and sectors where women work tend to be lower paid than those predominantly employing men. And women's jobs also are less likely to be management positions. So your boss is more likely to be a man than a woman, although there are large differences across sectors and different levels of management. Finally, there are also gender gaps in self-employment. However, these gaps are a little bit more contradictory. So on the one hand, a larger share of working men is self-employed in most countries than working women. And male entrepreneurs also do report higher incomes on average than female entrepreneurs, just like the gender pay gap among employees. But at the same time, if we compare parents only, we see that employed mothers are actually more likely to be self-employed than fathers. And that indicates that there might be something about self-employment that attracts women with care responsibilities. I was asked to go into some of the detail or some of the drivers of these gender inequalities, and there are really numerous reasons to explain why these gender gaps exist. And there's certainly too many to do so in 10 minutes. But some of the reasons are related closely to the type of work that women tend to look for more often than men. And these kind of explanations, I think, are more closely connected to gig work than others. And so I'm going to focus on these explanations. And a first important factor in understanding these gender gaps is to pay attention to what we actually mean when we ask if people work. Because women disproportionately perform unpaid care tasks for children, for elderly parents, for spouse, and any other dependent relatives. And while on the one hand, we do not count this work towards paid employment, many female workers do divide their time between substantial care responsibilities and paid work responsibilities, and certainly much more so than men. And so in consequence, women's participation in paid work is more intermittent and more conditional than men's. So sometimes paid work or full-time work is incompatible with care responsibilities. For example, when jobs require your presence in the office from 9 to 5 or on the factory floor from 9 to 5, but no childcare is available for these hours. Or if schools close at 3 p.m., as actually is the case in my own country. And so part of gendered inequality in the labor markets is driven by the practice of households to then plan women's work, but not men's work, around these care responsibilities. And so women, more often than men, withdraw from the labor market altogether or enter part-time employment. Then cultural preferences and beliefs can really reinforce these practices. And that stems in part from our idea of what a good mother is. And when we think of a good mother, we think of someone who prioritizes her children, who's always available for caregiving. And for substantial shares of households, mother's employment, or at least mother's full-time employment, is therefore considered culturally inappropriate or even harmful to children. And in more conservative cultures, this can even apply to all women, especially when work outside the household, for example, in factories, is potentially dirty and harmful. Now, sociologist Mary Blair Loy has argued that good motherhood is especially incompatible with paid work because all the things we say about good mothers are things we also say about good workers or ideal workers. These are workers that are completely and fully devoted to work. And so under these ideal worker norms and understandings, the most committed and valuable workers are those who work long hours, are always available, and whose family responsibilities do not get in the way of doing their job. And so for workers with care responsibilities, complying with this ideal worker norm is very difficult. And workers with care responsibility are predominantly women. Gender and care responsibilities also impact how we are perceived by employers and by colleagues, and that is how they also then are replicated and generated in the workplace. And so the way that we think about care responsibilities or assume that others have care responsibilities affect whether we think somebody is a fit for the organizational culture, whether we think somebody fits in our team. And on average, men are then more often rewarded for being ideal workers, not running out to pick up the kids when they are sick, not going home to cook. And according to relational inequality theory, workplaces then also import broader societal inequalities. So if in our societies, we generally think of men as stronger and smarter and better than women, that will also reflect on how we think about the competence of male versus female managers and who we see as a cleaner or a nurse. And these inequalities can then be further sustained or maintained in a workplace because more privileged groups can hoard opportunities. For example, when these groups determine who is promoted and they can make claims over the division of resources. For example, who deserves a pay rise. Now, finally, some of these drivers of gender-based inequalities in the labor market might also explain why mothers more often enter self-employment than fathers, although there is considerable disagreement over this matter. There are arguments and studies showing that women, and especially mothers in self-employment, especially if that self-employment is part-time, report having much more flexibility in determining when they work and where they work, in a way that a job in a firm does not. Home-based self-employment can also be safer and more culturally acceptable if it means that you can be employed, but also not have to work in a factory or somewhere else outside of your home. And studies show that self-employed women, especially when career-oriented, also report that they left organization-based employment in enterprises because of the discrimination they experienced, the hurdles they had to handle, whereas they feel they do not have these kind of hurdles in self-employment. On the other hand, there is a stream of research also saying that gender gaps in self-employment are in fact not driven by all these manners of combining work and family and avoiding discrimination, but rather see self-employment as a last resort. Self-employment as an alternative to unemployment if you cannot find a job at a firm, or if the hours you have to work in a firm are not compatible with your hours of childcare. And I think some of these questions are also going to come into the panel after this. So I'm going to hand over to them, and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Janna, for your nice talk.